Can a Muslim university be an Indian university? These are the first words in Dr. Laurence Gautier's book, Between Nation and Community, Muslim Universities and Indian Politics After Partition, in which she explores the history, nature, and contribution of two of India's leading Muslim universities, Aligarh Muslim University and Jamia Millia Islamia. Two institutions which, in her words, acted as crucibles for competing conceptions of Indian Muslimness in post independence India. Hey everyone, and welcome to Maybe Muslim. I'm Mariam Heather, producer and host of the podcast, and in this episode, I am in conversation with researcher and author Dr. Laurence, where we discuss how these universities, their members, and students played key roles in recognizing the needs of a new India in terms of education, nation building, and social reform. We dive deeper into debates and contestation of ideas around the Indian Muslim identity that continues to evolve and the ways in which many figures, men and women both, work towards making it more encompassing and holistic despite the internal and external challenges within these universities. The conversation also sheds light on caste-based politics, women's participation in universities over the decades, and the possible future roles of both these universities in the making of modern India. Hey, Dr. Laurence, welcome to Maybe Muslim podcast. It is so lovely to see you and so happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariam, for giving me this opportunity to present my book.
I'm going to start straight away from firstly saying again, I'm so happy and I've learned so much through your book, Between Nation and Community. I know we briefly interacted a couple of years ago, and as I was reading the book, I learned so much about the history, the influence of these universities on the larger Indian Muslim identity and the psyche, but also vice versa. And it I can't tell you, I think, how much it means to know that this book is out there. So when conversations around Aligarh University and Jamia happen, there is this heavily researched, well documented text that people can pick up. So I think my first question really is that how did you come about writing this book? You just told me earlier you've been working on this for a very long time. So maybe we can start from there.
So actually, I think it started because of different reasons. First, when I first arrived in Delhi as a student, so I spent 1 year at JNU, and one thing that really struck me was the importance of student politics. I'm French, I come from a background where student politics are very much part of our academic life, but it's true that I had not imagined that student politics would be as vibrant as this at JNU. So this is the first thing that struck me, the importance of student politics in Indian universities. And that is true at JNU, but in other places too, as I later discovered. The other thing is, as I started to read more about Indian history, especially the colonial and post-colonial history of India, especially South Asian Muslims, I was struck by the importance of educational institutions in the development of different conceptions of the nation and of the community. I have in mind the very well-known works of David Lelyveld on Aligarh's first generation and of Barbara Metcalf on Deoband. And these really became key, reference books. I also have in mind Margaret Carnot, of course, on the Delhi College, and Mushirul Hassan, who's also written very extensively on these institutions. And so these works made it clear that education had been very central to the development of how Indians saw themselves, as part of the Indian nation and as part of different religious communities. But much of this work largely focuses on the colonial period, and I thought that it would be really interesting to look at what happens to educational institutions in the post-colonial context, where we all know that education is key to nation building, not just in India, but in most countries, actually. And what was particularly interesting in the case of AMU and Jamia is that they are both state-sponsored public universities, and they are actually under the supervision of the central government, which means that they do have a national importance. They are institutions of national importance. And at the same time, they were founded by Muslim individuals and groups, especially for Muslim students, though not exclusively. I think that's very important to remember. These institutions were never exclusively for Muslim students, but it is true that they were envisaged as institutions having a special role to play for Indian Muslims. And so these two institutions were really at the juncture between nation and community, hence the title. And I thought that as such, they would be privileged sites to examine how Indian Muslim citizens position themselves in the aftermath of partition, both as citizens and as members of the Muslim community.
I want to maybe focus on this bit on community and nation building, because largely I think that understanding doesn't come out as clearly. That education, even if it is a Muslim university, so to speak, established by Muslim individuals, it wants to work towards what became a very 20th century phenomena of nation identifying itself to be. These Muslim universities, and I want to focus on Aligarh University first, saw sort of like a change after 1947. So AMU had its feet on the ground before that, but after 1947, it becomes very much focused on making itself a part of the nation. And I want to learn from you, how did Nehru's idea of Aligarh Muslim University, what was his idea? Like, knowing that now this country is new, it has the wounds of the partition, and you have this university which has established itself to try to call itself like the one that represents, and I'm using represents in quotes, the Indian Muslim community. And what did Nehru do with all of this at that time?
So, first of all, it is true that 1947 represented a moment of crisis for AMU. We know that AMU was closely associated with the Muslim League because some of the founding figures of the Muslim League were actually themselves at the top of the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which later became the Aligarh Muslim University. And in the immediate years before partition, large numbers of students, not all of them, of course, but large numbers of students and teachers took an active part in the Muslim League campaign for Pakistan. As a result of this, at the time of partition, AMU was widely perceived as a cradle of Muslim separatism. Before I go on, I just want to say that even though it is true that there was this close association with the Muslim League, we also have to remember that there was no political homogeneity among the members of AMU, and throughout the late colonial period, there were also members of the university that remained closer to Congress or closer to left-wing organizations. But it is true that there was this strong association with the Muslim League. And so when the partition came, the question that arose was, what will happen now to AMU, given the role that it had played in the movement for Pakistan? And while many politicians tagged AMU as a separatist institution, Nehru and his education minister Maulana Azad made it a point, and that's one of the key arguments in the book, to transform AMU into a symbol and an instrument of national integration. What do I mean by that? For Nehru, it was very important to defend the idea that India was not primarily a Hindu nation, but that Muslims and other religious minorities formed an integral part of the Indian nation. Now, this was not evident at the time, including within the Congress, where you had many Congress members who endorsed the idea that India was primarily a Hindu nation and that Muslims were suspect of disloyalty to the Indian nation precisely because of the legacy of partition. But for Nehru, it was very important to fight against the idea that India was primarily a Hindu nation, and so he wanted to make sure that Indian Muslims would very much feel a part of the Indian nation. And I argue that in this context, he turned towards AMU because he saw it as a very salient Muslim symbol precisely because it had played such a central role in the development of Muslim politics. And with Azad, his objective was to sift the legacy of AMU, because on the one side, they recognized the importance that AMU had played in the promotion of modern education among Indian Muslims. And at the same time, of course, neither Azad nor Nehru were happy with that past association with the Muslim League. And so for them, the challenge became to try to push AMU in a direction where it would retain its role as a prime symbol of Ganga Yamuna Tehzeeb, of this composite culture that formed the foundation of Indian culture, and as a symbol of modern education among Muslims, and at the same time ensure that it would, move away from that Muslim League legacy. Nehru and Azad were on these lines, and it's important to remember that it's not just, government authorities that try to impose that reorientation upon AMU members, because there were many people, many teachers and students within AMU who were on similar lines, who shared the idea that it was indispensable for AMU to reorient itself in such a way that it could play a key role in nation building. And so you have a wide range of teachers and students who were very much part of that reorientation. At the same time, AMU was, of course, a very diverse body and remains so after partition. And so you also had sections of the university that were concerned that the increasing control of the central government of the university would result in an erosion of the university's Muslim character. And so you always had that kind of tension between, on the one, how national and Muslim can we be? Are these two strands, can they come together, or do they pull us into different directions? And I would argue that for quite a few teachers and students, including Zakir Hussain, who became the Vice Chancellor of AMU in 1948, it was precisely because it was a Muslim institution that AMU had a key role to play at national level. It is by preserving and promoting a specific, Indo-Muslim culture that AMU had a special role to play in building India as a composite nation.
Yeah, it's I think this part about having there was no such thing as a homogeneous identity before and even after, the partition and independence, I think is a very critical point to remember, because unfortunately so it is very it's almost like people want to put things in some kind of a container. It's Aligarh Muslim University, so the Muslim itself becomes a tag that it is for Muslims, it is by Muslims, and they don't want to critically engage with it, that what's the history and what is the relevance of having the title or the name in itself. And I know you've mentioned you've actually elaborated on that part as well, like how did this tag of Muslim university create political conversations, interactions, and we might go that at a later stage into it. But I do want to use that as a thought for our listeners to continue on listening to this conversation, because you mentioned this line, this sentence, that these institutions contributed in the process to the emergence of pan-Indian Muslim community as an imagined community. You know, and I'm very curious about your this term imagined community, and I want to kind of hear more from you as to what did this mean at the time, um, and how did this influence the political decisions and subsequently decisions within the university, as these universities continue to reaffirm their existence.
So the expression imagined community, of course, is a reference to Benedict Anderson's work on nations, and the idea that nations are primarily imagined communities, in the sense that with the notion of the nation, there is the idea of a shared belonging among individuals who have never seen each other and yet are part of a common collectivity based on culture, language, religion. It depends, of course, on each and every nation, but there is this idea that you can't define a nation just on the basis of material criteria, that a nation exists primarily in people's imagination, in the sense that it is, that these ties exist with people whom they have never seen, and yet they feel a sense of shared belonging. And what Anderson shows is that, and I mean, he's not the only one, of course, but that this phenomenon, this of nationalism, of a shared, of being part of a shared nation beyond your local community, is a fairly recent phenomenon, associated with modernity. And the reason why I use the expression imagined community for the idea of the pan-Indian Muslim community is, again, the idea that Muslims throughout India form a shared community is not at all a self-evident one. We know that even till today, Indian Muslims are have very diverse linguistic backgrounds, different cultures. They are also divided along sectarian lines or caste. And yet, what you see is that around, especially the 19th century, so under the colonial period, you have, at least among certain sections of the Muslim population, a growing sense that despite all these differences that continue to exist, there is a shared identity that brings them together. Now, already before, of course, there was the sense that Muslims are part of the global ummah, the global community of believers. But here it's different, because there is the idea that there's also a sense of shared belonging among Indians of the subcontinent. And of course, this notion emerges around the same time as the notion of the nation, where the Indian territory really becomes a central political category. And so in that sense, the emergence of the notion of a pan-Indian Muslim community is, cannot be completely dissociated from the emergence of the Indian nation as a key political category. And what historians like, again, Lelyveld and Metcalfe have shown is that Muslim educational institutions have played a central role in the development of this idea of the pan-Indian Muslim community. For example, for Sir Syed, the Qawm, the community, which is originally a more socio-ethnic category, could refer at times to Hindustani Muslims, especially from North India, Urdu-speaking Ashraf, who were, basically, who belonged to the same milieu as him. But increasingly, the term Qawm expanded also to include fellow Muslims in other parts of the Indian subcontinent. So in that sense, Sir Syed and his followers at Aligarh played a key role in developing this idea of the Qawm as a pan-Indian category. And you also have, if you think of Deoband and other educational institutions, through their writings, through their fatwas, through their pamphlets, again, they contributed to diffusing this idea that Muslims in India form part of the same community. What is interesting is that there never was a single idea of what it means to be an Indian Muslim. And that's very important to remember. Throughout this period and thereafter, and even till today, of course, what it means to be an Indian Muslim is heavily disputed. But through these very contestations, these contestations reinforce the very idea that Indian Muslims do form part of the same community, even though there is no consensus on what are the contours of this community. So I hope I've answered your question, but yes. So basically, my argument is that, and I'm not the only one to say this, but is that the pan-Indian Muslim community is a modern idea that is heavily disputed and yet remains central to the political imagination of many, both Muslims and non-Muslims, actually.
You know, I was just smiling while you were giving this response, because to me that entails that there is so much capacity to imagine and to arrive at a sense of who you are and how do you belong, um, is a constantly evolving and a constantly changing dynamic. And I think that speaks a lot about, um, that we are constantly influenced by the world around us, by the circumstances, by the changes and the shifts in, like you said, like from, it can keep on expanding. You know, it might start from a nationhood, but it has so many variances to it, like even within the country. Like for me, every time I interact with someone, I myself, even though I belong to the Indian Muslim community, I still don't know so much. You know, I was born in North India, so I have that North Indian sort of heritage of sorts. But I go to the West or I go to the South, this community has very different ways of expressing itself. And I think also of who gets to imagine. You know, does is it only a political class that gets to imagine the community? Is it only the like you said, like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and his sort of the way he looked at the Ashraf lens of identity, was that, do they get to imagine it? And again, I highly urge everyone who's listening to this podcast to pick up your book, because you are asking those questions. You know, as we progress through the decades after India's independence, that's a question that's constantly getting, challenged. And it is therefore, it's not surprising that the birth of Jamia also comes from within Aligarh. And that to me was the nugget I didn't have as information. And I kind of want to lean towards that, and go to our next question, where you write about AMU students who followed the anti-colonial movements. Like you write, Aligarh's rebel sister did not claim so much to speak for the Muslim Qawm, but rather to challenge from within Aligarh's loyalism to colonial power. And I want to really hear more about that, because this was something I didn't know. And so maybe if you can share about how the internal divisions of AMU and the changing realities of India's political landscape influenced the birth of Jamia Millia Islamia.
So, from when Sir Syed established the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, so the ancestor to AMU, he was clear about the fact that one of the objectives should be to build a privileged partnership or relationship with the new colonial authorities. And as a result of this, he and his followers adopted a loyalist attitude vis-à-vis the colonial government, and that remained true for much of the colonial period. However, again, the Aligarh was never a homogeneous political body, and what you see is that in the 1910s, um, at a time when you have the rise of anti-colonial movements, these anti-colonial movements also make an impact among the students and teachers of the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. The 1910s also corresponds to a time when you have the rise of pan-Islamism, at a time when the British are fighting against the Ottoman Empire. And so there is, among certain sections of the Indian Muslim population, the fear of what will happen to the caliphate, which was associated with the Ottoman Empire. And this movement for the caliphate, the Khilafat movement, which is essentially a pan-Islamic movement, became at the same time a deeply anti-colonial movement. And so what you see is that in the late 1910s, you have a coming together of these anti-colonial and pan-Islamic strands that make a huge impact among sections of students at Aligarh. And it is in this context that some alumni and students of Aligarh, who were led by the famous Ali brothers, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, challenged the loyalist attitude of the college authorities. They joined hands, as we know, with Gandhi and his non-cooperation movement, and urged students and teachers to basically stop cooperating with the British, to make Aligarh an independent institution. So the original idea was to transform Aligarh into an independent institution, an institution independent from colonial authorities. Now, this didn't work, especially at the time when the college authorities were very keen to keep a good relationship with the British because they were asking for the university status. And so this was really not the time for them to turn away from colonial authorities and from colonial financial support. And so here you saw in 1920, what you see is a rupture from within Aligarh between those who continue to endorse a loyalist stance vis-à-vis the British and those who follow the anti-colonial track. And these are the ones, so led by the Ali brothers, as well as the Obandi ulema, play a very key role in this too, who established Jamia Millia Islamia. So that's why I call Jamia Millia Islamia the rebel sister of Aligarh, because basically it is born from within Aligarh against the colonial, the loyalist stance of Aligarh. And when they are faced with the impossibility to reform Aligarh from within, then they create a separate institution which becomes Jamia Millia Islamia. And Jamia Millia Islamia, in that sense, really epitomizes the diverging political strands that you see among North Indian Muslim elites that are present at Aligarh at the time.
It was so fascinating for me to read that. Honestly, I was underlining, paragraph to paragraph, because again, like, to me, all of this stands as sort of recognizing that there is never this one idea that can sustain itself. Like, it will always have opposites. It will always have voices that are going to challenge it. Um, and then that just makes you understand that anyone who tries to say this is the only way things work is actually coming from a very narrow understanding of history.
If I may just add something, sorry, just one precision. It's important to understand that even though there was this rupture between Jamia and Aligarh, there were always bridges between the two institutions. And one of the really interesting aspects for me that I discovered as I was doing my research was to see how closely related individuals across the institutions remained in spite of the institutional breakup. For example, Mohammed Mujib was one of the really major figures of Jamia Millia Islamia in its early period, had his brother, Mohammed Habib, the father of Irfan Habib, who stayed at AMU, even though he was himself close to the Congress, but he decided to remain at Aligarh. And this is one of many examples which showed that actually in practice, individual connections were always there in spite of these diverging institutional trajectories. And that remained true also after independence. You have many people who have studied in both institutions or who have studied in one place and then taught in the other. So that's also the whole point of studying these two institutions side by side, is that they have diverging yet closely intertwined trajectories.
I mean, I think it just goes on to show that at the at some level everyone was just trying to work towards a common shared goal of making sure that you could work towards something that the community can be served. um, whether it starts from one way or the another, it still is driven towards a community aspect and not simply having a political. I mean, it can never be one motivation. um, I'm I'm just sitting with everything you just shared, and I'm thinking about now in the post-independence India. Jamia is rooting itself in Delhi. You have this sort of political clarity that they want to have Aligarh as sort of a standalone institution that can, again, in quotes, speak for the Indian Muslim community. I mean, I wonder, and this is something which really comes from like the response you were sharing earlier, is like, what were the core visions for AMU and Jamia following India's independence? In what respects were they similar? In what respects were they same?
Well, I think that there's actually more than differences. What dominates after partition is the similarity in their visions, um, which also has partly to do with, as I said, the fact that these are essentially the same people, or at least people from the same milieu who head these institutions. The most striking example being Zakir Hussain, who was the vice chancellor of Jamia for a long period of time just before partition, and who becomes the vice chancellor of AMU at a critical time in 1948, just 1 year after independence. And in a way, he's the one who's in charge of ensuring that AMU becomes a symbol and an instrument of national integration. So in both these institutions, there is a shared goal of making sure that Muslims form an integral part of the nation building enterprise. I would say that's the main goal that appears, very visibly in the archives for that period. And in a way, Jamia did not have to face quite the same challenges at AMU because, unlike AMU, it was not, quote unquote, stained by its past association with the Muslim League. Jamia Millia had always remained very closely associated with the Congress Party, especially with the figure of Gandhi. And in that sense, it did not require quite the same kind of reorientation as AMU. But in both cases, and whereas at AMU there was this idea of putting aside, as I said, the Muslim League legacy, there was also the idea that this kind of reorientation involved some institutional changes. So among the key changes that you have at the time is the adoption in 1951 of the AMU Act, which opens the court, which is the main administrative body, to non-Muslims. Now that was a major change, which will be heavily contested in the subsequent decade, which is something I touch upon in another chapter. But so there were more changes that took place at AMU, but in both these institutions there was this shared goal of, as I said, making Muslims an integral part of the nation-building enterprise. And how did they do that? So first of all, by promoting a culture and a history where different religious communities, were part of a shared trajectory. So that, of course, went against the idea of Hindus and Muslims forming separate blocks. So here, for example, AMU's Department of History, which was very famous, played a critical part in challenging communal and colonial narratives of Indian history, which endorse this idea of Hindus and Muslims, being part of separate blocks. They instead emphasized the composite legacy of India. So that's one example. The other example was also by promoting Urdu as, again, a symbol of India's shared cultural legacy, and not just as a Muslim language. So in these many ways, these institutions played a critical part in putting forward a conception of India as a composite nation of which Muslims could be an integral part. It is very important here to keep in mind that these institutions did not see themselves as having a role to play just for Muslims. They saw themselves as having a role to play for the entire nation. And so by promoting this composite legacy, they really wanted to put forward a narrative, a non-majoritarian narrative for the nation as something that was instrumental to building a unified nation state in the aftermath of partition. There's one more thing I wanted to emphasize is that besides, promoting composite culture, another way in which they tried to participate in nation building was also through social reform and educational reform. And that is particularly true in the case of Jamia, which was not just a Congress-leaning university. It was also, in the late colonial period, an experimental school that played a critical role in promoting basic education as well as adult education. And that's something that I really try to emphasize. And so through basic education, through educational reforms, they try to promote social reforms that would be part of a larger a constructive program, a bit on the same line as what Gandhi had in mind, where basically through educational and social reforms they were trying to lay the foundation of an independence that would be meaningful um, for basically for all Indians, not just across religious differences, but also across social backgrounds. And Jamia had a very strong orientation towards the non-elites by promoting basic education and adult education among illiterate populations. And so I argue that this is another way in which they try to play a meaningful role in nation building. It was by basically promoting social reform through education.
I remember when, again, all of this was new to me and really enlightening, because I'm learning about the location of Jamia, choosing to have Jamia located in a place where a lot of people could come and easily access the institute. Making sure that the different kinds of classes were there. Like, it wasn't necessarily just teaching education for the sake of it, but active life learning skills were also there. And I think I remember you writing it in the book as well, that there was some contestation around it as to what is more important over the other. Um, and what was Gandhi's idea of nation and the work that people can put in, what kind of skills they can learn. So skill development was also another thing that the founders and the members of Jamia wanted to focus on, which shows so much breadth of commitment from different people to really rope in whatever was possible to help as bigger communities as much possible to people who didn't have that kind of those resources to access education in the past. And you've touched on a lot of things, as you mentioned, about this sort of non-elite focus as well, which we'll come to later. But I want to kind of focus on the language bit here, because the way Jamia was looking, the members of Jamia were looking at Urdu and wanted to make it, like you say, Hindustani, kind of establish that Urdu very much could be a part of the larger lingua franca, if I may say, of the country beyond the scope of the community itself. I had this quote from you, actually, that really struck me. Is in a message published by JMI's Hindi department in September 1970, Mujib asserted, in Jamia, Hindi and Urdu share the same bond as blood sisters do, and Jamia's wish is that these languages should not be used as weapons of conflict, but as a foundation for love and national unity. I just kind of maybe want to emphasize more on, like, the way you have talked about in the book as well, like how did teachers at Jamia and also students work towards establishing the understanding of Urdu as an Indian language rooted within the subcultures and ethnic groups of the country and not simply a Muslim language.
So before I answer this question, I just wanted to say the choice of Urdu was, epitomized different strands in Jamia's educational project. Um, First of all, when Jamia Millia adopted Urdu as its main medium of instruction, it was also part of an anti-colonial stance, in the sense that, unlike AMU, which had made English its main medium of instruction, um, Jamia made it a point to adopt a vernacular language as its main medium of instruction, precisely because Urdu was not the language of the colonial authorities. So the adoption of Urdu was, part of its politics, of its anti-colonial politics, and part of its efforts to distinguish itself from Aligarh's loyalist stance. But of course, Urdu is much more than just any vernacular language. It is a language that is associated with North Indian populations across religious communities, and also with, of course, populations in Hyderabad, but here we are more talking of North India because of the location of Jamia. So it is a language that is a transcommunal language, and yet in the late colonial period, what you see is a growing polarization of Hindi and Urdu along communal lines. What is happening is that increasingly there is a politicization of linguistic debates whereby Hindi is associated with uh, Hindu communities as opposed to Urdu, which is associated with Muslim communities, which is something that Urdu speaking Muslims have always challenged. Of course, they've always challenged the idea that Urdu is exclusively a Muslim language, but increasingly in the political discourse, Urdu becomes associated with Muslims alone. And of course, in the post-partition context, this becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy because Urdu is largely excluded from the public education system, which means that it only survives as a medium of instruction in Muslim schools. As a result of this, it becomes more and more exclusively a Muslim language, even though this was not the intention of Urdu speakers themselves. Now, in this context of growing polarization along communal lines of the languages, choosing Urdu alongside Hindi as a medium of instruction, because Hindi is also adopted as a compulsory subject, becomes for Jamia members a way to both access non-elite groups who do not speak English, but also of making a political statement to say, we want to go against the idea that Urdu is a Muslim language because we want to continue to hold on to the idea that Urdu is part of a shared legacy across religious differences. And so the defense of Urdu becomes a prime symbol of their ongoing fight to promote an idea of India as a composite nation. And so when in 1970 Mujib speaks of Hindi and Urdu as blood sisters, it is again to show that instead of thinking of these two languages as enemies, which unfortunately became the case in many politicians' discourses, we need to think of them as languages with closely intertwined legacies that together form an integral part of our shared legacy as Indians. And of course, by emphasizing the Indian character of Urdu, it is a way to contest the idea that Urdu is an alien language associated primarily with Pakistan. It's also, of course, beyond this, a way to continue to argue that Islamic cultural symbols closely associated with Muslim communities are not alien to Indian culture. They too form an integral part of Indian culture. And so the idea really is that the defense of Urdu is not just a cover up to defend Muslim interests. My argument is to say that the defense of Urdu is revealing of these ongoing efforts to show that cultural elements that are also associated with Muslim communities should continue to be valued as part of that shared legacy among Indians.
It's so beautiful the way you put it, because I was speaking to someone earlier last week, and we were just talking about how language, the only way language survives is when people speak it. Like in recorded history, even now, when we if anyone studies ancient languages, you can understand the text, but you don't know how people speak. The people who did are dead. And and Urdu or any other language like the vernacular, they need more and more acceptance and enrichment as sort of like cultural sort of walls. Like, these are places where culture will survive. And if you start eliminating that, you're kind of erasing a large part of what you understand as your culture. So you can say that, oh, Urdu is a foreign language, and don't have schools that carry it as one of the languages to learn, or don't have institutions that teach it. It's sort of almost like self-sabotage. I was actually speaking in a couple of episodes earlier, I was speaking to one of the authors, Nazia Akhtar, who has written a book about Hyderabadi women and their Urdu, writings. And Nazia said this as one of the things where she was like, I hope people can go back to source languages more. Like translations are very important, but the essence of literature, or like the time that that literature was written, really lies in its source language. And I completely understand that, because when I was reading her translations, I was so enamored by the way she's talking about, these writers in 1950s, Urdu, Hyderabad, talking about their lives through fiction. But I was like, I wish I read it in Urdu. I wish I could read it in Urdu, because it's a very different experience. And so, when you talk about this, shared heritage, I think it's very important that,
Of course.
especially now, people understand that you're not simply restoring a language because it's precious and you have a sense of belonging to it, but because that's the only way you'll understand your culture, amongst other shared things, but primarily that.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm convinced of the fact that language is the main medium or vehicle of culture. Hence, the importance of preserving a language that
Yeah.
um, allows different. I mean, people from different religious groups to come together around a shared heritage. The problem, of course, is that in the post-partition context, in practice it becomes more and more exclusively a Muslim language. But what we see nowadays is also there are lots of different initiatives to try to revive an interest in Urdu
Mm.
literature independently of religious affiliations. And I have in mind, for example, the Rechta project, which is part of these efforts to revive an interest in Urdu literature, um, without constantly placing it back in these debates on communal identities.
Yeah, absolutely. You did touch upon this a bit in your last answer, but I wonder if you have anything else to add to this part where you talk about how did the Jamia authorities ensure that they work towards one of the institution's core missions, which was to address the educational needs of non-elite groups, specifically among Muslims.
So, when we think of Jamia Millia nowadays, I think we think of Jamia primarily as a university. But what is important to remember is that for the longest time, i.e., until the 70s, 80s, Jamia was primarily a school. It had a college, but it was primarily a school um, that too a school that focused largely on what I call basic education, which is basically a form of elementary education that was shaped in the late colonial period and heavily influenced by Gandhian ideas. Um, so, as I said, so it focused on basic education rather than university level education. Um, it used to do so the vernacular language in order to address groups that did not have access to English. It also promoted adult education, and that's another very important part of Jamia's mission. One of the key figures of Jamia Millia in the late colonial period was Shafiqur Rahman Kidwai, who established the Idara Taraqi, Talim e Taraqi, so the Organization for Education and Progress, which basically established different centers in different localities, especially in localities where you had low middle class populations, or in villages also around Jamia. Let's remember that Jamia, until fairly recently, was not inside Delhi. It was in the rural outskirts of Delhi, and it was surrounded by villages. And so many students and teachers were involved in promoting education among these rural populations that lived in the neighborhood of, of Jamia. Um, these educational efforts were combined with social, reform efforts. For example, promoting intercaste or inter-community activities through literacy classes. Um, it was also involved in, for example, promoting skill training among women. And here I have in mind the efforts of Sidika Rehman Kidvai, so the wife of Shafiko Rehman Kidvai, who established in the 1950s the Balak Mata centers, which were centers meant to promote literacy and skill training among women in these neighborhoods. So you can see how Jamia's educational mission was closely associated with efforts of promoting social reforms among non-elite groups. This aspect of Jamia's mission still exists nowadays, but of course it is not as prominent as it was in the late colonial period and early independence period, because now Jamia is primarily a university turned towards higher education, even though it still provides education at primary and secondary level.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad that you talked about like this holistic way of how Jamia was trying to recognize that there was this larger work and deeper work it had to do in really building up communities from the non-elite backgrounds. At the same time, I'm really glad that you kind of put a full chapter on talking about women, and you mentioned this, that just as the unhyphenated Indian was an upper caste male Hindu, the ideal Aligarhian was an unmarked Muslim citizen, usually North Indian, Urdu speaking, and upper caste. He was also a man. Much like AMU's founders, JMI authorities first focused on Muslim men's education. Can you share more about women, including Muslim women's contributions to both of these institutions?
Yes, I mean, so first of all, let's admit that neither AMU nor Jamia were an exception in not making women the center of their educational program, of their educational mission, because in the colonial period, when these two institutions were established, most institutions addressed primarily male students. So in that sense, there was no Muslim exception here. But it is true that in both these institutions, women were originally at the margins. The Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College was initially meant only for male students, and it is only after Sir Said's generation with Sheikh Abdullah and his wife Begum Abdullah, who were themselves followers of Sir Said, that there was a school for girls that was started, and that then gave way to the Women's College. At Jamia, it was a slightly different trajectory in the sense that among the first students, you did not have girls, but of course, there were many women who lived in Jamia, in Jamia's compounds, either because they were the wives, sisters, or daughters of Jamia's teachers and founding figures. And these women, which are often fondly called Jamia's first generation, played a critical part in pushing for girls' education. So it started in their own homes, where they started, providing a private education to girls, and gradually what happened is that they pushed for girls to be included in the classrooms, in the same classrooms as boys. So here, Jamia adopted a co-educational model, unlike Aligarh, where co-education developed only at a postgraduate level. And so again, here it's very important to keep in mind that providing co-education was not an initial part of Jamia's project, and that women played a critical part in making it an integral and characteristic feature of Jamia's educational mission. Both at and Jamia and AMU, what we see is, of course, a growing, you have throughout the late colonial and especially after independence, of course, a rapid expansion of the number of girl students, which is parallel to the larger growth of female education in India in the post-independence period. And so there were not just larger numbers of girl students or women students. These women took an increasingly visible part in the cultural activities of these institutions, and when I say visible, I have in mind, for example, stage performances with both men and women coming together on stage. Now, this was again, this had nothing self-evident, because there were quite a few people who challenged the legitimacy of having both men and women together on stage, and that became a recurring bone of contention between different sections of the universities. But it showed, how women's presence became increasingly visible. Women also played an increasing part in political activities. At AMU, normally it's only postgraduate students, female students, who could be part of the students' unions politics. But in practice, even women who were, part of the women's college and who were not supposed to take part of the students' union, did participate in different ways in protests or in political activities inside the campus. And gradually, from the 1950s onwards, you see women being elected in key positions in the students' union. And all of this triggered debates around the Muslim character of the institutions, because while you had certain sections of the university, especially those that were associated with the left, who pushed for cultural activities and political activities that involved both men and women, you also had certain sections that felt that it went against the Muslim character of the university. So here again, you can see how women's increasing participation in the university's life becomes a bone of contention, and also a symbol of the different conceptions of what should be the character and the mission of Aligarh. So in that sense, I think that looking at women's position in these institutions is also a good way to look at these ongoing debates about what it means to be, what should be the character of these universities. Yes, and of course, at the end of this chapter on women, I try to draw a connection with women's growing visibility in protests, including in the most recent NTCA protest, to show that actually it's part of a long history which is rooted in university politics, because many of these women who take part now in larger political protests, including outside the university, were initially exposed to the first forms of political mobilizations on campus, and very often on women-related issues. For example, they would push for equal rights for girl students or for women students to access the library, or later hours to go back to their hostels. So very often their initiation to politics started with women's issues on campus, fighting against ongoing hierarchies between men and women, or ongoing differential treatment of men and women. And that,
If I remember correctly, you also mentioned the bit about which classes to attend, what subjects to take, which subjects.
yes, you're right. So there's also, that there's this exposure to politics, but of course you're right. What is very striking is that throughout this period, you also see, an opening of women's options for their choice of studies and later for their professional careers. Because initially, women were largely confined to literary subjects or to education, because these were considered to be appropriate for women. And then what you see is that increasingly, especially from the 70s onwards, you have more girls in science courses, but also in commerce. And there's a growing effort of university authorities to, push women students in this direction, also to take up jobs after their education. Because again, that was not self-evident. Many women who were educated even at university level in the early 50s would then not go on to pursue a professional careers. Usually they would marry, and that university education was of course a very valuable cultural baggage, but it was not necessarily seen as something that would lead to a professional career, whereas increasingly from the 70s and 80s onwards, you see increasingly graduates from these institutions taking a professional path and expanding their professional career options. But that is not specific to Muslim institutions. That's also part of the story. That's so. On the one side, what is striking about women's the question of Muslims' position in these institutions is that it shows how unexceptional AMU and Jamia were in their trajectory of women at the margins who become increasingly central to these institutions and having more and more choices in their studies and career. And at the same time, what is specific to these institutions is that women's growing presence and visibility in these institutions triggered debates about what it means to be a Muslim institution. And so I try to bring these two strands together in that last chapter.
It is, I mean, I learned about the Zaidi sisters through your book.
Yes. They're very fascinating characters.
Exactly, and I obsessed over them for a bit. Like I went and read everything about them, kind of recognized, how valuable their contributions were. I read up on them, and I got very excited, and I was like, "Oh, how much I wish I could have interviewed them for this podcast." But yeah, I think there's this one strand that I'm picking from what you said earlier was about like how one, there was no exclusivity towards the fact that these institutions were very male focused, but actually any other institution as well was. And the second bit is that this sort of parallel, if I may call, movement or sort of endeavor to have more women's participation was happening across the board. And I kind of want to focus on continuing on that sort of thread around what were the other ways that the marginalized groups were trying to kind of build themselves and get access to education. And we have talked a little about like how AMU wanted to position itself as representing the Indian Muslim community, but it largely attracted students from the North Indian Muslim community, especially from those within the Ashraf or the elite classes. And in that sense, what was the role of JMI and other universities? You've also talked about Osmania University, educational institutes, including madrasas and Islamic schools, in ensuring that those from the marginalized Muslim backgrounds were offered access to quality education.
Yeah, so I think both AMU and Jamia did try to make gestures at sections of the Muslim populations that would not usually have access to mainstream higher education, including students coming from madrasa backgrounds. So, for example, both institutions made special efforts to welcome students who had been educated in madrasas. And more recently, in AMU, you've had the establishment of a bridge course, which is specifically targets these students to facilitate their transition from madrasa to English medium university education. So there is that, but there's also the question of women, because again, let's remember that especially in the early independence period, women are still largely absent from these institutions, and so one way to so they are themselves a marginalized category, and one way of expanding access to higher education or to education to these women was, of course, to have the girls' school at ANU, the women's college, or to have co-education at Jamia. But it was also to allow private students, who very often were women, to take examinations. And that may seem like something not very relevant or a detail, but actually it was quite important, because that became a way for women who stayed at home because of Purdah rules to get a degree from these institutions, thanks to this private student program. Jamia also made it a point to develop correspondence courses for Urdu medium students, again with the idea that women would be particularly interested in in following correspondence courses in Urdu from their homes. So in these different ways, Jamia and AMU both try to address needs of marginalized sections of especially Muslim students, not exclusively Muslim, but including Muslim students. That said, these institutions, and especially Aligarh, continue to face the criticisms for being an elitist institution. And for example, in the 1990s, when you have the rise of the Pasmanda movement, which highlighted caste hierarchies among Muslims, many Pasmanda leaders saw AMU as an elite institution which was incapable of addressing the needs of the majority of Indian Muslims and focus instead on the elites. So you see that kind of constant tension between, on the one side, institutions, especially AMU, which are seen as rather elite, even though in practice their student body is expanding, and more you have students who are first generation students who join the institutions, but they continue to be seen as largely elite institutions. And at the same time, you do have efforts of these institutions to try to address more marginalized sections of the Indian Muslim population.
Yeah, and I think just in the same vein, my following question is really about like, how did caste-based politics, and you've mentioned about the Pasmanda movement, but there were other emergences of it as well before that in different castes. Um, how did that influence the role of AMU and Jamia within the larger Indian Muslim context?
So what you see in the post-1990s is a growing importance of caste-based politics at national level. Of course, you have caste-based politics that start already in the late colonial period among Muslims as well as non-Muslims. For example, you have Muslim caste associations that emerge in the late colonial period. But let's say that the question of caste gains increasing importance after the implementation of the Mandal Commission report. And this also triggers a renewed interest in the caste questions among Muslims. This is the time when you see the emergence of the Pasmanda movement that makes caste a central category of its politics. So Pasmanda leaders challenge the discourse of Muslim elites who claim to speak for all Indian Muslims and say, look, actually these Indian elites, these Muslim elites only speak for themselves. They focus only on cultural issues which are of little relevance to the vast majority of Muslims. We, the vast majority of Muslims of low caste background, are more interested in question of employment and access to education. And these Pasmanda politics, of course, affect directly or indirectly Aligarh and Jamia, especially Aligarh, which is often seen as an elite institution. And here you have Pasmanda leaders who basically challenge the whole idea that AMU serves the interest of all Indian Muslims by saying that actually Aligarh continues to be in the hands of Muslim elites and continues to serve primarily the interest of the Indian Muslim elites. Now, this is partly true, but at the same time, we must remember that throughout the post-independence period, Aligarh's student body is expanding and increasingly includes sections of the Muslim population that come from lower middle class background. And for these categories of the Muslim population, Aligarh remains a symbol of upward social mobility. And in a way, its very elite tag is appealing to the extent that, I mean, in the sense that they see Aligarh as a place not just where they can acquire education that will then open up new professional opportunities, they also see Aligarh as a place where they can acquire a cultural training that will contribute to their elevation in social hierarchies. So my point here is to say that, yes, in that period, you see the question of caste being used to challenge the elite character of Aligarh. At the same time, Aligarh in practice is increasingly admitting students from lower middle class background. you also have within Aligarh students who start to mobilize more explicitly the question of social hierarchies among Muslims to challenge what they see as traditional Muslim politics turned primarily towards symbolic or cultural issues. And so within Aligarh itself, you have students who say we must recognize these social hierarchies, and we must address the needs of the vast majority of the Muslim population, which they define primarily in terms of access to jobs and access to education. So there is, a renewal, an ongoing renewal of the different strands of Muslim politics within Aligarh. And actually, that's something fascinating about Aligarh itself, is that you really see how the university crystallizes and becomes a crucible for different forms of politics and different forms of Muslim politics. So you have, minority politics that are extremely important at Aligarh. So a form of politics primarily geared towards the defense of minority rights. You also have some students who emphasize primarily the need to regenerate Islam, to promote Islamic reform, and you have other students who say actually our priority should be to address the socioeconomic needs of the majority of the Muslim population that belong to backward sections of the Indian population.
I think it's a question that requires a lot more voices from within the different caste groups in the country to examine it. And I think you have in the book helped navigate that chronologically, and I think that is very important as a starting point. And so I hope that there are more conversations and more writings around it that can really put forth this idea and create more room.
Absolutely. I mean, Pasmanda politics, sorry I interrupted you, but just, Pasmanda politics are a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, at least a form of Muslim politics that explicitly makes caste a central issue is a fairly recent phenomenon. And I only briefly touch upon it because it is related to the last period, the decade of the period that I study. But fortunately, there are many more works coming up now that do examine in greater detail the different strands of Pasmanda politics from the 90s onwards. So, as you said, more voices and more work is required on this issue.
I'm very glad you're sharing this because I would love to, interact with all those writings as well and just learn more. I have last two questions, but I'm gonna ask the last question first and then move on to the other one. Um, there were so many things you've written in the book that I learned about them thanks to your work. Were there any findings or were there any interactions that surprised you as you put this work together?
I think what struck me most was Jamia's ambition to play a role at national level, in spite of its very limited means. Of course, now it's a central university which has many more resources, but let us remember that Jamia became a central university only in 1988, and so for the longest time before that, Jamia continuously struggled with the lack of resources. And in spite of these severe material limitations, there was almost from the very beginning an ambition to play a role in laying the foundations for a meaningful independence. And so, as I said earlier, to play a role that is meaningful not just for Muslims' uplift, but more generally for the nation, be it in terms of educational experiments or social reforms or promoting a non-majoritarian conception of the Indian nation. So that kind of, and actually, Jamia was recognized, that is also very striking, was recognized as a prime actor in educational reforms in the late colonial period, including in international fora. So this kind of mismatch, if I may say, between their ambition and actually their capacity to develop educational experiments on the one side and their limited resources on the other is something that surprised me. I was also struck by Nehru's rather daring move to put forward AMU as a symbol of national integration at a time when it was largely seen as a cradle of Muslim separatism. And so, if you put it back in its context, it was, I think, quite a daring move, but I think a very meaningful one. It also reflected some of Nehru's ambiguities, which is something that I develop in the book, and I won't go further into that now. But I think it says a lot about the conception of the Indian nation that he intended to promote.
Yeah, and I think it says a lot about, I mean, there are so many actors and there are so many visions and there are so many questions that emerged in the aftermath of India's independence. And there is, in order to truly understand what nation building entailed, then one must truly sit with all these strands of work and movements and politics and social reforms and motivations. And I think your book has kind of really tried to do that and really put it out. So again, I think this is just like me hoping and ensuring more and more people pick up your book. And I think as a last question, and I know you don't talk about contemporary realities for either of these institutions, but just as a thought, how do you imagine or envision the role of these two universities within the country and the future of the country?
I think that for better or for worse, they remain identified as major Muslim symbols and major sites where the question of Muslims' location in the Indian nation can be asked and discussed, and where different conceptions of what it means to be an Indian Muslim can be developed and confronted to each other. So I think that they have a very important role to play in these ongoing debates about Muslims' location in the Indian nation. That's one thing, and the other thing is they continue to remain extremely important as symbols of and instruments of upward social mobility for large sections of the Indian Muslim population. Of course, they cannot single-handedly address the educational needs of all the Indian Muslim population. But as symbols, they offer a promise of possible upward social mobility for a large number of first generation students who aspire to, improve their socioeconomic status. So, in that sense, I think that in a context where, on average, Muslims tend to be more socioeconomically backward than other religious groups, and so I think they have a very special role to play, both in upholding that promise of a better future for large numbers of Indian Muslims, and in upholding the vision of an Indian nation that makes all its citizens, equal partners, and an integral part of its imagination.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation, and I'm truly grateful that you could share your time, and incredibly happy that the book is available. And I highly recommend everyone pick up Between Nation and Community, Muslim Universities and Indian Politics After Partition. Thank you so much, Dr. Lawrence. This has been a lovely interaction.
Thank you very much. I really thank you for giving me this opportunity too.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please review and or give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to them. You can also listen to other MBM episodes with Nazia Akhtar, Sulfat Lela, Nusrat Jafri, and others whose work, voices, and stories help expand the definition of being an Indian, a Muslim, and everything in between. Thank you for listening to Main Bhi Muslim. I'm Mariam Haider, and we'll be back with another episode in a few weeks. Until then, take care. Lots of love and gratitude.